So it's Scuttlebutt time. It's always fun when these videos come up, but I have to say, sometimes I save them and put them off for a bit, sometimes I'm busy, and I just don't have time to give them the attention they deserve, so I don't do it until I do have the time. Scuttlebutt 9, oh my, oh my. Let's see what we've got in here. What have we got waiting up? Now, there was originally about 23 comments which I had listed on this. And I thought, should I do them all, or shall I try and keep to the roughly 8 I normally do? Or it feels like I normally do roughly 8 big ones. And the trouble is, they were all quite big ones. And some of them, one of them specifically requires me to go into an old video and make an apology. So, because I misspoke. So basically, I decided I keep it 8 this time. Roughly 8 slides. Might be more than 8 questions. So, let's see. Logistics, linguistics, and structure. I'm so used to saying logistics, I said it in the wrong linguistics. I wonder if I knowledge the drawn out pauses and a dog with a squeezing toy makes it hard. Please take this constructive criticism. Regards, Ben. Well, Ben, that was on Battleships 185. Which is questions, our naval history questions answered live. So here is some constructive criticism in return. I'm sorry I'm human, but I sometimes have to take a pause to think before I answer questions. Now, the dog squeezing toy, I do apologise. I don't usually give him the toy when we're live, but he was looking quite down that day, so I gave it to him and hoped he would be quiet with it. He wasn't. But I did apologise during it and took it off him quite quickly. So, that's life. But, again, drawn out pauses, that's usually me trying to collect my thoughts and make sure I'm getting the right words out. Because sometimes I'll have notes in front of me and I'll disagree with the words. In the case of this one, which is literally on a live show where I am answering questions live in front of me, I'm sorry. I have to think of the answer before I answer it. I don't have the questions prepared on a script. The whole point is the questions come in while I'm live. And the first time I usually see them is pretty much when they're entered into the system. I might catch sight of some of them being entered into the system as they're coming in, and occasionally I'll spot one and go, oh, I need to do some quickly get something up before I answer that question when it comes up, and I'll do that. But literally, I usually see them and then I have to answer them, and that means that sometimes I take a pause to think because I'd rather try and give you an accurate answer than necessarily my gut reaction or what the first thing that comes into my mind. So, yeah, pauses happen. And from Mary Rose to Victory. Drac and I, please. The Queen didn't say me and my husband. Uh, well, Vertek, two reasons of things to come up. One, the Queen might not say it, but she would definitely not. She would say herself and her husband because that would be the formal linguistics, because she'd be speaking in a formal setting, and she'd be talking about her relationship partner, which would be a formal phraseology. Similar in the terms of a formal business thing. Me and Drac are friends. Good friends. But that means we tend to refer to each other in colloquial English or less formal tones. So I'm sorry if I don't speak all the time sounding like I'm from Downton Abbeys. That's not my style of talking. The whole in this setting, I am from my home communicating. I'm in a t-shirt. If I was in a lecture theatre talking students wearing a suit, I would speak more formally because that's how we have to approach things. Um, Welcome to English. We have variations, I guess. I'm not really sure how else to respond to that. With that being said, let's move on to the first history one. Now, this is actually a recent comment on quite an old video. It's on the Major Axis Navy's 5 problems and how to fix them in January 1939, which is a couple of years old, I think, honestly. Maybe even older than that. I forget. This channel's approaching 5 years old, and the sheer number of videos I've done is now becoming obscene. Hi, Dr. Clarke. Thomas, thank you. Love your channel. Super informative and great to fall asleep to. falling asleep to view videos, I get to watch them several times before I see the whole thing. Seriously though, top-notch stuff. Thank you. I think. I hope I'm not giving you weird dreams. I'm not quite sure about falling asleep to me. That could mean I'm giving you very weird dreams, and I apologise now, because some of the history stuff I'm talking about is very esoteric sometimes. I've got a question for you about battleships and gun and armor sizes and the one-upmanship countries did. Rather than going bigger to respond to this, all that, why didn't anyone simply stop participating? It isn't like the ocean is boxing ring and fighters fight another of the same class. In this video, for example, you discussed what Britain would have done with the KGV class if they had found how big the Yamatos were. And at the production line would stop and they'd crash design a big gun. Why not just build a few more KG-5 battleships? Taking this logic further, why didn't anyone just go for mission kills rather than trying to get through super thick armor? Build a ton of 12-inch heavy cruisers. When they come across a bigger ship, they either fight if they have the numbers or they run. Sure, they're in danger, but everyone else is too. Basically what I'm saying is, would you rather have 5 KGVs or 15 to 20 80,000-ton cruisers with 9 to 12 12-inch guns? Well, I put a little answer to this quickly myself, but I'm going to elaborate on this. The problem is logistics, crew numbers, and certainty. Navies are not in the process of gambling with national security, and whilst on paper the option of many smaller assets would work, and certainly reflects the RN's own discussion of 6-inch versus 8-inch gun arm cruisers in the period, the only certain asset you have that should stop a large, massively armoured and armed warship is your own large, massively armoured and armed warships. It's like with aircraft carriers in this period. Aircraft at this point have the potential to be war winners. But they weren't judged yet there in the 1930s, and so you build them, but you still built the capital ships as well, just in case it turned out to be wrong. Because the price of failure if you turn out to be wrong is so high and it takes so long to build these assets, it is always judged better to build them and have them, rather than make that bet, and if you end up being wrong, losing the nation because you don't have time to create them. We'll elaborate more on this Scuttlebutt 9. It's also the policy of how the destroyers attack larger assets. They swarm them in numbers. So, you're talking nothing really revolutionary. Although it might seem it. But the thing is, on a good day, if I've got 14-inch guns, 15-inch guns, 16-inch guns, 18-inch guns, all things being equal, I should be able to outrange and out-hit my opponent with smaller guns. This is why people still build capital ships when they're building cruiser swarms. Because whilst in theory with 6-inch guns, as happened to Scharnhorst, you can do a mission kill her with a 6-inch gun. That's what the Royal Navy did at the Battle of North Cape. They mission killed her and then the Duke of York turned up. And that was what killed her. But they mission killed her first. They'd taken out her radars and systems like that. You can do that, and a mission kill might work. But if it doesn't, and if Scharnhorst had been more luck with her radar and systems, and had managed to hit those cruisers with her 11-inch guns before their 6-inch guns had got into range, then the Royal Navy would have lost 3 cruisers very rapidly, because an 11-inch gun is going to massacre one of those cruisers. If those shells hit, they're going to cause masses of damage. Massive damage. That was the whole thing for the Graf Spee when it's out doing its missions. It's got 11-inch guns. That should, in theory, make it a lot stronger and able to outmatch its opponents. Now, the fact it didn't was because of the tactics they employed and because of the situation it found itself in. It was never going to have that kind of success in that scenario. Those cruisers were behaving like destroyers. They were attacking as hard as they could, tacking in as hard as they could to get in as close as they could, as quickly as they could, and fire as hard as they could. But if the Graf Spee had been a Scharnhorst, especially with 9 guns rather than 6, and had been able to coordinate its fire better than it was because of the situation it found itself in, because one of the troubles you have is that 3 guns are enough to bear and aim and probably to an extent deter. But if you're trying to engage 2 different groups with your guns, you either have to ignore one and concentrate on the other, which is what they tried to do, concentrate on Exeter, ignoring Ajax and Achilles, Or you've got free firing at one target and free firing at another target, and then that's not going to be enough shells coming in to possibly give you a likelihood of actually hitting the target. You might deter them, but not hit them. This is why the 6 forward, 3 aft is a better arrangement, and that's why so many battleships end up being that sort of arrangement with 6 forward and 3, 4 aft. Because that means you have enough to deter aft, and you have enough to engage and possibly destroy forward, and you can coordinate those turrets better because they are firing from a similar position, and they have a similar angle of bearing. It's a whole discussion to get into and targeting, and honestly, Drac has done a very good video about these things. So, probably won't do one for a while myself. Good thing about being friends. But basically, there is a logic, but it might work, but it might not. And that's the thing. You don't take as a nation risks if you can avoid it. If you're being a sensible government. I know this is strange when we look at some modern defense spending and modern procurement. A lot of governments have taken a lot of risks based on the idea that someone else would always be there for them to do the job. That wasn't sensible. It's not what sensible governments do. So that's why your idea doesn't really come about. Plus also, there's the problem that those vessels you've outlined were specifically forbade by treaty. You're not allowed a cruiser more than 10,000 tons. And if you're using your tonnage to build, your capital ship tonnage to build it, then if you're having to build an 18,000 ton cruiser, and your limit is 35,000 tons, you're not even getting a 2-for-1 on what capital ships you can have. So instead of you being able to get a swarm of 5 King George V's, getting 5 King George V's or 15 to 20 18,000 ton cruisers, you would get 5 times 35,000 tons, which is, well, let's be honest, 175,000 tons. Divide that by 18, you've got 9, roughly. Maybe if you make them 17,500 tons, you've got 10. It might work. It might not. They might be hopelessly outclassed by everything they meet, because there aren't enough of them. This is the trouble with naval treaties. They're very restrictive. Various people have written various things about ideas for what scenario they should have done, and I once came up with the concept of the treaty shouldn't have been type specific. They should have been tonnage specific. So let's say Britain and America are allowed 1 million tons of ship. They can decide what they want. These are vessels which fit the categories of destroyers, cruisers, whatever. 1 million tons of ship. And if you consider how the Washington Treaty starts out, to an extent, the reason they don't go with that is because they've said any ships below 10,000 tons, you can build as many of them as you like. So, to an extent, if the treaty followed that policy right through to World War II, then the odds are, prior to World War II, there'd have been a huge surge in destroyer production and cruiser production, and whilst the capital ships would have kept going and the carriers would have probably been built as they were historically, Britain especially would have upticked its destroyer and cruiser production because it can build as many vessels under 10,000 tons as it likes. And that would have made sense. It would also probably have been something the government would have resorted to in the Great Depression as a way to boost the economy, ordering a whole load of cruisers and destroyers, because you could do that. But the London treaties become prescriptive even at that level. And so this stops a lot of these adaptations occurring. This is one of the problems with naval treaties. They stop you being able to adapt your force and maybe evolve it. Because honestly, once you have some very long 12-inch guns and you have radar, so you can guarantee hitting your opponent, yeah, i.e. Alaska's, you can do that. But the thing is, there's a reason the Americans build Alaskas and then stop and then carry on building the Iowas. Because that Alaska class costs almost as much to crew, support and sustain as an Iowa. And one for one, the Iowa's better. You need the pack of Alaskas to take out the Iowa. You don't need a pack of Iowas to take out an Alaska. So, here we go, and I'm going to quickly... Now, if we just hear this through, and then I'll explain what I did wrong.
Yeah, example. And it gives you both the tonnage, the volume, and the financial value. The volume and the financial value. And the financial value is in millions. Pounds million. So food, drink and tobacco, retained imports, £132.2 million worth in 1930. That's a lot. Raw materials and articles mainly unmanufactured. Value, 100...
Now, some of you noticed, some of you did, some of you... Brendan Robertson. Really? Naughty historian? I'm not quite sure that's right. But let me explain what I did here. And this is proof you should never read your own notes. You should check the table you've got up on the wall. You see, on my notes, when I put them in across, I copied the million but hadn't put in the details below. I decided to put the actual table up in front of you for you to see, but I wasn't reading off the recording screen, I was reading off my notes. And on my notes, I hadn't copied that part in, so I didn't have that part below to tell me. And I didn't notice when I was doing the editing and checking, so I apologise. I don't think that really goes against the point I was making, though. It's basically, it's all done in percentages compared to 1935. I have no idea what happened then. Why did it suddenly go weird? No idea. Anyway, it did what it did. And yeah, it was a mistake on my part. Doesn't detract from the content in many ways, because it still says broadly the same thing I was saying, but it's in percentage terms rather. The rest of the table's in percentage terms. This is because, to an extent, economists love to do this sort of thing to people. They say, oh yeah, one of these tables is going to be in, one of the columns in the table is going to be in millions. It's 1935, and everything else is going to be in percentages of that 1935. What I should have done is probably provided my own table and just converted it all into pounds to make it simple. But I wanted to go with the actual source to show off the primary sources, because I was trying to be honest, I was trying to be cool. I thought they were cool. So yeah, that's on me. I transposed it wrong in my notes and I've munched up. I think this is about the third time in the entire course of this channel I've had to make this kind of mission. But I make them. When I make it wrong, I did wrong. But the thing is, don't take this wrong, Brendan. A few other people spotted out, but Brendan, naughty historian. I don't think this... Is that how you talk to your work colleagues and things when they make a mistake? You call them naughty? I don't usually use that. I don't even... Describing little children who've done something wrong, that's a naughty person. In this case, I think the example, the phrase would be, you frigged it up. Not naughty. Maybe yours is politer, in which case, thank you. But, yeah, I frigged it up. I made a mistake. It's on me. But broadly speaking, I was talking about the quantities which were coming in and out of the UK, and what are the costs and issues of bringing in an convoy system, and therefore, to be honest, the table's still saying what I needed to say. But I do apologise for making that mistake. Anyway, back with the next comments. Now we have Nimitz class, and this one was on the Nimitz class, and this one was an interesting one because it's about the Chinese and their carrier conundrum. A quick question to a peer thread. This is from Robin Lieberman. As you mentioned, you always need at least 3 carriers to ensure one is on station. How does this apply to China? Sure that it could use their carriers in the same way across the globe, but they also have some interest far closer to home. So if there was some action around Taiwan, for example, they could, with some planning, ensure a far higher percentage of carriers available. How many carriers do you think China needs to ensure a short-term advantage? Or do you think China will start to station carriers around the globe in similar fashion? Because if you need at least 3 carriers close to China, this whole signalling in the rest of the world is out the window, right? Depends what they want to do, okay? Currently, they seem to be projecting a fleet of about 6 aircraft carriers. I wouldn't be surprised if these were mostly based at home. They will probably have one rotating in and out of the Indian Ocean because that is a critical space for them in terms of their maritime Silk Road and their import of oil and other duties and other things. So, yeah, that's the thing is they run a very different approach to freedom of seas than we necessarily approach it as. They're looking at it more from their own perspective of freedom of seas for the movement of their goods, and that's what they worry about. They don't. Whereas, to an extent, the Americans inherited the British approach of freedom of seas is great for everyone. The reason why the British were keen on freedom of seas for everyone in peacetime was because in wartime it meant there was trade for them to cut off. I won't say it's the same for the Americans, but people who believe that freedom of seas, which is free for everyone to go around in peacetime and is always good for everyone in peacetime, is purely enlightened about enlightenment, are sadly a little bit mistaken. There is a lot of self-interest in there as well, because freedom of seas, global trade means that there is trade for you to cut off. The British war plan for pretty much any war versus a majority of land power or anyone else is blockade. That doesn't work if they don't have trade going by sea. That doesn't work. In fact, if you're going by the old British maritime tenets, global trade and globalism is actually the best thing you can have for our old methodology of waging war, because if you're inside a blockade, you can't adjust. Outside the blockade, you can adjust to different sources and you can have the trade carrying on. But inside the blockade, you're cut off and it's far more difficult for you to adjust your economy. So globalism is great from a maritime blockading perspective and therefore maritime warfare perspective. But yeah, I think the Chinese will probably have a scenario where they'll usually have about 5 out of 6 aircraft carriers probably close to China, probably in the South China Sea, East China Sea, maybe in the near Pacific. I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing, as they have more carrier groups, regularly them operating into the Western Pacific, maybe even occasionally popping into the Eastern Pacific on visits to South America, etc. Mainly for the status point of view, and mainly for the power projection perspective. It's a short-term 1 month, 2 month deployment for them to go from where they're normally operating to go visit South America, but the impact on America of a Chinese carrier battle group turning up and visiting Venezuela is probably going to be outsized. So yeah, but I think they will probably try. They would probably want to have at least the ability short term to mobilize 2 to 4 carriers for any invasion of Taiwan. That's probably what they're aiming for. But when you consider their current carrier build program and their carrier introduction program, they're not going to have that available if they're aiming for 2027. The risk point is from 2027 onwards. That's when they are aiming publicly to have the capability to do for a unifying China, which is important for certain dates in their historical context. And it could be a bargaining tool, it could be a political statement from their wolf warrior diplomacy for status, and it could be the real thing. You don't know. But the old saying with the international relations and diplomacy is that when someone tells you they're going to do something, you believe them. If it's bad for you, you believe them, and you prepare for it. If it's good for you, you hope for it, but you don't believe them until they actually do it. That's the standing policy in diplomacy, because countries have interests and countries change their opinions. They're like humans. I know, surprising thing. Like, we recognize in certain nations in the world that companies are recognized as having the right of personhood or being sort of, in some ways, a human, and having those protections and those protections and rights. Well, we have to consider countries are. They are large They are large organizations of human beings. They are going to act in some ways like humans, and they are going to be just as mercurial. But I do think China will probably, considering what they've been doing in the Indian Ocean already, and considering their relations with India and their relations with partners in Africa and the dependence upon them, I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up seeing, rather like the Americans have a carrier based in Japan, and usually have had carriers and ships based in Spain, etc., forward based around. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually you see the Chinese regularly having an expeditionary force centered around an aircraft carrier being deployed and operating from the Indian Ocean. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a regular feature in about the next decade or so. And then it's shameless book plug time. Now, shameless book plugs. I keep getting suggestions about them, and yes, there are more books coming. They're written. The pictures are procured. Everything's now going through editing software. And I'm trying to get time to do it. And the trouble is, every time I seem to have it running, and I want to leave it sort of sorting and try and check everything out, and I try and do the uploads and check things, that's when we seem to have internet troubles lately. So this is April, end of April. There will be a book. Yeah. The only trouble is that every time I crack it open to check it and get I spot things I want to add in, and that then means I have to redo stuff. So yes, and I have to get the pictures off. I have to get the pictures off Drac, because there's a load of pictures coming from him. There's a load of pictures coming from my own time aboard the lovely, the most beautiful Sackville. HMCS Sackville is a gorgeous ship. She really is. So there's lots of good photos in there. It's going to be a fun thing, but then I have to certify that they're all my own photos, which is fun. But we get there. We do. We get there. It's going to be a good one. And when that one comes out, then it's going to be a case of, what does that do? How well does it do? Is that going to affect the schedule for next books and following books? Because if that makes enough money, then it will do. It will have a big impact on things. And yeah, that's all down to you. And also, that'll mean I'll finally change the Shameless Book Plug page. There'll be multiple books there. The thing is, I've left it like it is. While there's only one book, a sort of reminder to myself every time there's only one book and I need to keep on writing, I need to get them done, I need to get them through and published, as a sort of reminder to myself, and that's why I haven't changed it. And then when there's more books, there's going to be changes in the photos, and it's good. And it's all thanks to you. It's thanks to your liking, sharing, subscribing to the channel. It's thanks to your support that we're here. That being said, though, now this is an interesting question from Paul from Chicago, because he does a lot of your questions. There are often quite a few I do respond to. And it starts off with the time marker, which always makes it easier for me to work out what the question is exactly about. Sometimes people say, you said this, and I go, it's a 2.5 hour video. I'm sure I did say that, but I'm not sure where and in what context, so I'm going to have to go back and read through all the scripts and everything. If you make my life easier, I will be able to respond a lot quicker, because if I have to take time to go, right, it was in context of probably this section, so I would go and read that, check what slide was behind me, and then rather than being able to just click to it, that means I have to allocate time to go and do it, whereas this way I can just go click and go, oh, there I am. Where do you stand on ship inflation regarding ratings? For example, classifying the big frigates, like the really big Spardeck frigates and Razzies. For example, should Majestic and Constitution and potentially Indefatigable be counted as 4th rates? They're clearly different from the average run of a frigate. And to your point earlier, one of the big Americans, probably not a 36-gun Chesapeake, but rather President of the United States Constitution, could potentially mess Leopard up. Similar to this, when the second rates lose a deck after Napoleonic Wars, 84 and larger gunships with only 2 decks, more stoutly created with better iron scantlings. Should these still be considered second rates as well? They behave almost nothing like traditional second rates, or nor do they have the virtues second rates with virtues as second rates with the advantageous tall poop deck. Particularly when you've got Caledonians even bigger first rates of 120 guns, and truly monstrous Duke of Wellington's act. Well, it's the joy of ship evolution. What you're basically talking about in terms of the later ships, the ratings of the first rates, etc., with getting the bigger and bigger guns and the more and more guns, is that at a certain point, once you're dealing with iron scantlings and you're supporting ships up and you're doing everything you can to make them, and the weight of guns, and that starts to become a factor, those ships are still second rates. They're carrying a second rate portion of guns. But the thing is, you're also dealing with the fact that at that time the third rate had reached an 80 gun ship. And at that point, you've kind of got a fusing between what is the higher third rate and the lower second rate. And to an extent, they start pushing in to each other. And the thing about it is they had a huge stockpile of third rates. And with good maintenance, those ships would last for quite a while, and that's what they did. And so it was more a case of we're building first rates, we're building second rates, as we're calling them, but that's because they're worthwhile building, and these ships are growing bigger, and there is a growth. But the realistic thing is the third rate has stayed roughly sort of the same area. It's the same sweet spot. It's about 80. It's about 74, 80 guns. In which case, to an extent, the second rate is covering for the third rate at this point, because the third rate has grown up. And there's all sorts of discussions. It's kind of what comes in when I was talking about HMS Warrior in the Admiral's shaping ship scenario. You know, there's a very real scenario where she ends up being a 2-deck ship, because 2-deck has become quite such a common design policy. It's a nice balancing point. Because the point that's been going on the whole time, and you probably noticed this, is A, ships are growing slightly bigger for even individual decks, but also the guns they're carrying are getting heavier and heavier. And the broadside is less to do with number of guns and more to do with the power of those guns and the weight of those individual guns to carry. And so you've got the fact that, you know, when you start looking at HMS Warrior's broadside, there are some ships that are line, some multi-deck ships line, which had a lighter, weaker broadside than HMS Warrior, which was a single-deck frigate. But is considered a frigate because she's only one deck. I think one of the problems you have is if the Napoleonic Wars sort of scenario had carried on for another 20, 30 years, I think the ratings would have changed quite dramatically. But the wars sort of ended in roughly 1815. And we don't really have a war on that scale again until we get to World War I. That's when we're having a global war. And by that time, the world has transitioned massively. So what you were dealing with is a whole lot of technology was being developed. It was coming through and was creating itself and getting invented and adapted. And so you have a lot of changes going on. And I do think, yes, the ratings might have been adjusted. The ratings might have ended up being adjusted. I do think some of those ships might have ended up being classified as fourth rates. But that might have led to a whole thing where the fourth rate is now the heavy frigate, the first rate equivalent of the frigate world. And then you have the fifth rate is the equivalent. Fifth rate is the equivalent still of the third rate of frigate world because of this balancing, and the sixth rate is still what the sixth rate and unrated ships do. But there is a debate going on. There's even a scenario where you could see some really big frigates coming in, where it would be a third rate, a 64 gun third rate, so 32 guns each side, single deck ship. There are actual discussions going along for that. So it's doubtful. The designs, ships that length weren't working out, and you only have to look later on at, again, discussions from Warrior in the how Admiral shaped ships scenario. The long frigates, especially before you started building them as ironclads, an iron hulled, like HMS Warrior, they're reaching the length of how long they can be built. Doesn't mean the architects weren't considering it. It's just they were finding new problems that they hadn't realized. And realistically, what you're seeing, especially towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars and what's happening after them, is the technology is catching up. As I've said before, though, first-rate ships and second-rate ships with 3 decks, they have problems. There are problems with balancing. That was always a problem with the second-rate. It wasn't long enough. There's a reason why there's a reason why towards the end of Napoleonic Wars, it'll be discussed in this in a second, the Royal Navy has more first rates operating than third rates. Because honestly, first rates operating than second rates. Sorry, misspoke. The reason is because the first rate's actually a better sailor because it's longer. It's a more expensive to build, but a length, beam, height ratio balance out far more in favour of stability with the first rate than the second rate, which tends to be a bit short for being as high as it is. And that can cause all sorts of manoeuvrability issues. So, yeah, that's one of the reasons why, again, the second rate, when they can take it down and still carry enough guns to be a second rate, they're going down to a 2-deck design. But it means that you always have a scenario where now the first rate becomes the 3-deck design, the only 3-deck design to carry its number guns. The second and third rates are the 2-deck designs, and the 4th, 5th, and 6th rates are single-deck designs because of the weight of the gun they're carrying and stability they can provide with that weight and the number of guns. Which means, I suppose, to an extent, Warrior would be the debate was probably between making Warrior a third rate or a 4th rate, and it was a 4th rate which won. But she'd have probably ended up an roughly 80 gun ship. So probably would have ended up a high-end third rate, and could have ended up being an 84 gun ship, so being a second rate, if they'd done the design. But as said before, there's all sorts of decisions going through that process, which is how she leads to be. And one of the original ideas for why she would have been a 2-gun deck ship is because they thought the boilers and engine room space might actually have to be larger than they were, take up more space, and so you'd end up with a split gun deck for your lower gun deck. And so you could still have a continuous gun deck, you'd have the gun deck higher. As well as they did some other design considerations. It's all an interesting thing, but it's basically times of evolution, and things are changing. So then we have losing second rates, which seemed to be an appropriate question to come from, and this is also on the 4th rates question. Dr. Clarke, on the slide shown at 1437, it is shown that, between 1794 and 1814, the Royal Navy lost the count of 2 second rates. What happened to those 2 ladies? I imagine that it would either be lost in action or 2 bruised up to economical repair. Also, do 6 rates in that 6 rates sit in between great frigates and post ships? 6 rates are post ships. A post ship is basically a ship which is high enough, which means when you're appointed as captain of it, it gets posted. Okay? The Royal Navy will post it to the Gazette. We'll put it up on the board outside. So anything which is a 6th rate or higher, anything which is a rated ship is a post ship. Often 6 rates are referred to as post ships because, let's be honest, they're not frigates. They're too small. But they're the same size as brigs, but they're not brigs. So they are a post ship. That's quite legit. There's also, helpfully, mail ships, which are literally for carrying the mail. But we'll leave that to one side. With what happens, and I've already sort of discussed this, that table is of ships in commission. So the Royal Navy hasn't lost the count of 2 second rates. One actually was lost during the time period, and they decided to activate HMS Victory rather than activating second rate. But literally, that's because of the Royal Navy's increasing view about the stability issues of second rates versus first rates. And there's a lot of work going on, and it's one of the interesting things of if war had continued past then, you'd probably seen the growth of the second rate numbers go up again, because they developed the technology and the ideas that they were going to build those 2-decker second rates. So the thing is, the three-decker second rate was proving too much of a sailing hazard for the amount of sail they wanted to put on them, because they're cramming on extra sails to try and get more speed, copper bottoming, everything to be as possible, and station keeping. They're using them because they need a certain number of three-deck ships in commission, and a second rate is technically cheaper to run than a first rate. But every time the Royal Navy from 1794 to 1814, the Royal Navy has a choice of activating a first rate or a second rate. They are picking to commission, whenever they have the choice and the freedom, the first rate, because they are better ships for sailing. That is quite literally what's going on. The Royal Navy is activating first rates. They still have a stockpile of second rates and first rates. This is one of the things. Those are the ships in commission. Please note, once you start looking through the numbers of ships the Royal Navy has availability, you can pretty much go down that list on every single one of those numbers and add between 25 and 50%, depending on what you're looking at, of they have those ships in ordinary sitting around. Fourth rates, they have almost 100% sitting in ordinary, compared to the numbers they have in commission. Third rates, it's well known the Royal Navy at no point ever seems to have more than 50% to 2/3 of their third rates they actually have on their books, theoretically, in number, including the ships in ordinary and commission and various other stages, actually active. Now, this is because some of the ships in ordinary are being used as hulk, store ships, all sorts of things. So honestly, their level of status as a ship in ordinary is probably not that great. I don't think they'd actually be activable. But they still have a huge depth or reserve. And often the limitations put on the Navy is how many sailors can they actually recruit? How many sailors can they get, rather than the ships available? Because they're continually building ships, they're continually capturing ships. One of the fun things is when people ask me about those figures and they go, can you justify this? I go, well, think about it. They take quite a large chunk of the Danish Navy twice in that period. Twice. And they activate like one or two of those ships, but the rest of them sit in ordinary the whole time. Until they're useless. So they buy them, they purchase them, but they sit in ordinary. So you've got basically the entire Danish Navy is captured and sits in ordinary. You've got Dutch ships, you've got Spanish ships, you've got French ships. So they're not just the ships they're building, they're the ships they're capturing. And sometimes they look at them and go, well, that one's too good to scrap, but it's not in good enough condition that we want to actually use it. So put it into ordinary, and then if we're short of ships, we can do it, because it's already mostly there, we just need to repair it. That's the reality you're dealing with when you're dealing with the Royal Navy in this period. And other navies are the same. The French periodically find their stockpile of ships in ordinary get burnt. The British, of course, the English had lost a lot when the Dutch had raided Medway, and that was quite a lot of the ships which the Dutch took. But they'd still built up a stockpile elsewhere, and that was another reason why the British end up having stockpiles all around the country. They have various yards all around the country which store in the ships in ordinary. So never again will, if you do attack like Medway, oh great, you did one. All the others are now active. Good luck. But yeah, so the second rates, they're not lost. Well, depends on how administratively you count them. It's more they are going for the first rates because they're better, and they're in terms of sailing and what they're requiring to do. And I said the second two-deck second rate starts to come out very shortly after this. Now, this was an interesting one because Michael Songa, I think Drac is working on an Indian Ocean video. I know he's working. I kept toying with it for ages, and I know he's working on one. And maybe by the time this video is done, it'll come out, or maybe it's not. I don't know what his schedule. But it should be revealed there's quite a lot going on in the Indian Ocean, including Operation C, which gives a slightly different scenario in this. Biggest flaw of your statement is Roosevelt declares war on Japan after the Japanese invade Dutch East Indies. Yeah, the US president can't declare war, but honestly, under that scenario, he could probably get Congress on side because it's Japan. And they've already done sanctions, they've already done all sorts of things. It's Japan. That was my argument. So, basically, the other problem for them is, in this scenario, if they're not getting involved, they're going to find themselves in a lot of trouble afterwards, is what they're probably feeling, because any scenario which results in them losing influence in the Pacific is not going to be something they like. Now, your enjoy on the Kido Butai and the chance of the UK carriers being as effective in night attack on the Kido Butai is optimistic. They'll be fully intact. This will be a fully intact force, a core of highly skilled pilots and aircraft handlers intact. Yes, it would be, but the Japanese pilots weren't trained in night flying. Not enough. They had some, but very few, and they had no night air defense strategy. So they were entirely reliant on guns. They had no radars. So, yeah. British planes are generally superior to the British counterparts at this stage in the war. Yes, they are, but that's the whole reason why the British attack at night. Because the British pilots are trained to do the night attack doctrine. The Japanese haven't done it because of various reasons, and we won't get into them too deals. But honestly, the Japanese, the only ones, the Americans don't even have a mass training of night flying at this point. The only service which does is the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, and the reason the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm has it is because the British forces were obsessed with fighting at night. I've discussed this about Jutland, so there's a level of obsession, because, please note, there are good reasons not to do it. You lose a lot of pilots in training. You lose a lot of aircraft in training. It's attritional on your forces. It causes all sorts of trouble on your own carriers when you're doing the night flying, night takeoff, etc., and all sorts of systems. It's expensive. There are many, many reasons not to do it. You would only do those in the 1920s and 30s, which the British had, because they're obsessive over it. It's not normal. Sometimes people look and go strange, oh, you're saying the British are better. They're not. They're obsessive over it. As I've discussed before, World War II is about righting the things they feel they did wrong in World War I. That's literally the Royal Navy's modus operandi. They're fighting at night, everyone, because of what happened at Jutland. And Operation C is actually an interesting thing, because the Japanese don't detect the British fleet. The British do detect the Japanese fleet. The British are planning to launch a strike, and if they hadn't copied down the data wrong, they'd have probably hit them. So then you go into the FAC weave. Well, it's lovely. The FAC weave is a lovely thing. It's unlikely the British would have implemented tactics such as FAC weave to allow the US planes to hold their own. The British have been fighting an air defence war in the Mediterranean for months, years at this point. They've been implementing all sorts of tactics. The FAC weave is very good. It is very good. It's one where the aircraft, basically your wingman is turning in and you keep crossing over like that. And if the Zero tries to line up on you, then your wingman can take it. If your Zero tries to line up on your wingman, you can take them out. It's really a very good idea. But there are lots of other tactics currently being employed by the British, and they're just as adaptable as the Americans, because they've had to be. Because if you look at the number of fighters they usually have versus the land-based fighters and aircraft coming from the Italians and Italians mainly, but also the Germans in the Mediterranean, they've had to be pretty good. So to say that the British can't learn operationally like the Americans can seems wrong. Okay, they have the same abilities to learn. Now, I think even if the US enters the war at this point, it's not a fully awakened giant we see in the natural trial, but a heavily divided and reluctant combatant best. Yes and no. They're actually doing a lot of the build-up is already on place well before war begins. I think in this timeline, they're probably not the same giant. They're probably not the same romping, stomping force. I did agree with that, but if Italy stays neutral, then the British, well, whilst the British don't have the Mediterranean experience in this to learn from, we know what they did in the Mediterranean. So if Italy stays neutral, you'd apply that experience. It's also going to be far more British assets out there. So that's going to change the Japanese plan, as I discussed through. It's going to change a lot of the options. I still don't think, though, that the Americans would allow a scenario to develop where the British might possibly win against the Japanese alone. And you might think that the British can't win, but with an increased carrier force out there and with the scenarios they have available, I think it's plausible for them to win. Plus, and here is the other little crucial factor. If you consider the German naval strength at the beginning of World War II and what they're deploying, and you consider the forces the British lose in the Mediterranean and the forces that get poured back to the Mediterranean to fight in the Mediterranean, those forces wouldn't have been pulled back. So that means there's a lot more submarines, a lot more assets for the British in the Far East. The British have probably reinforced the Far East quite heavily, which again I got into in that whole video. So yeah, I can understand where you're coming from, but I don't think that's really the quite the right line to take in this scenario. Because, again, I think I can see your point about America being like... I don't think America declares war on Germany ever, unless Germany declares war on them. But Germany is not Japan. The American view on the Japanese, the American view on the Far East, on the Pacific area, and things that happen in the Pacific is not the same as their view in Europe. Europe is in many ways, has their legacy of World War I and other scenarios from that. And I think you are perfectly right that if Germany doesn't declare war on America, it's very, very difficult for Roosevelt to declare war on Germany. But with Japan, there is a difference there. There is a great difference in terms of relationship. So that's where the idea comes from. Now, this was an interesting one for me. If Japan does decide to accept negotiation and peace, and this is on Empire Prepares, what if the British Empire invested more in the 1920s and 30s, even if only in the short term, how does it affect the United States' involvement in the Second World War? Without the attack on Pearl Harbor and Germany's subsequent declaration of war, would there be political will and popular support necessary to overcome the isolationist tendencies within the country and enter the war directly, or would the contributions be confined to a continuation of Lend-Lease and neutrality patrols? I suppose in theory you could have an accident with German submarines on surface fire, raiders fire on a neutrality patrol, and have America enter the war that way, but that seems like it would require a very specific set of circumstances to line up and is by no means guaranteed to happen. Well, the interesting one with that, Gilbert, is that it's very, very difficult, as I've already said today, for America to enter war against Germany without Germany declaring war. The thing is, though, in the scenario we've talked about, if Japan does accept negotiation and keeps the peace, etc., and you put British Empire, perhaps what if the British Empire invested more in 1920s and 30s, but I'm suggesting your question is separate to that scenario, so please correct me if I was wrong. But in the scenario you're talking about, if Japan doesn't go to war, I see what probably happens historically is the Americans just keep expanding neutrality patrols further and further across the Pacific, further and further across the Atlantic. Sorry, I've been in the Pacific for the last two questions, and my brain's now going. And I can also hear a BT engineer wandering around upstairs. So I have BT engineer in the site while I'm doing it. They came today, and I've had a network engineer, and so I apologise. I've been recording this bitty with people coming up and down the stairs, and so it's been fun. It's been fun. But without the attack on Pearl Harbor, yeah, I don't. And if America doesn't get involved in the war that way, I see them expanding neutrality patrols across the Atlantic, and that could eventually lead to something. But there's also various other options going to take place. I think there is never the doubt that with Hitler in charge, you could have a scenario where he ends up declaring war anyway. Because you have to remember, he believes great nations are not declared war on, they declare war. Yeah, he is that nutty, but we'll leave that particular piece of fruitcake to one side for this discussion. And so, with neutrality patrols keep expanding, he might well see that as a de facto declaration of war without a declaration of war, and provide the declaration of war anyway. He might well do that. There's also the scenario that as the war goes on longer, And especially as the British take advantage of Canada and America to be their arsenal and growing things, and they're slowly developing their technologies and getting everything in place, and the radars getting better and better, better interceptors and other things for air defense of the UK. Things are changing for the Germans. The strategic balance is starting to change. The heavy bombers are getting more and more powerful. I think a longer war does see a rise of a British equivalent to the B-29. Mainly because the British are really eyeing up the German oil fields. And if it hadn't been for the American entry into the war and need to divert resources to preparing and supporting for all the US Army Air Forces that come and all the other things, there's a lot more resources to focus on other issues, on the British focus issues. There's not. It's one of the things that's often forgotten is that the Americans coming over is great. It's very useful, but it does divert a lot of attention and resources from where other areas where the British could be applying them to support and sustain the Americans when they arrive. The example I tend to give is the British have a whole network they built around the UK for moving oil between airfields and aviation fuel between airfields. Well, they have to expand that network. That network has to be expanded. And all sorts of things have to get done to support the American airfields. And it makes sense. It's a good thing to do, but those are resources which are therefore not able to allocate to other people. Those are experienced technicians, those are experienced planners, engineers, allocated to that, and they could be doing something else. And eventually you could move around enough people, you could have all sorts of interesting things going on. So that's the point. I think you would either have an incident or you would have a German declaration of war, but I think it would be a gradual expansion of neutrality patrols that would lead to it. And that was, in many ways, for Roosevelt to accomplish his post-war aims. And he does seem to have post-war aims, because whilst he both doesn't want Britain to fall to Nazi Germany, he also wants to remold the world into a vision which is probably closer to Wilson's vision in many ways. He is at heart a bit of an anti-imperialist, and again, there's nothing wrong with this. This is his views. He's the elected president. That's his perspective. Some of the relationships and the discussions he seems to have had with Stalin were interesting, but that's the world we lived in at the time. Honestly, Roosevelt was looking to a world where he thought and he felt who were going to be decision makers post World War II, and there was a world changing. And if you think empires are going to go, then the British Empire is no longer going to be at the decision making table. In which case, the largest countries are going to be ones there. It's a perfectly reasonable, logical idea if you think empires are going to go. The French Empire's not going to be there. The British Empire's not going to be there. The greatest strategic shock of the 20th century, according to one American professor who worked with, was the creation of the Commonwealth. And I looked and went, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, they're supposed to be anti-empire. They're supposed to not want to be part of any connections with you anymore because you're their imperial power. The fact that the Commonwealth exists at all in any form, and let alone has the relationship it does, is completely anathema to what we were expecting." And I can understand that. Although there were lots of shocks for the Americans in the post-imperial era. There were lots of shocks. Anyway, hope you enjoyed today's Scuttlebutt. What have we got coming up? Let's see. Next week. Oh, we've got a 6.6 fleet. I'll be recording that tomorrow, hopefully. That's the plan. Oh, maybe I'll be rewriting it and recording it Friday. Who knows? But I'm trying to make sure they're recorded the week beforehand. Gives us more space. And next week's going to be a very busy week for me anyway. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and have fun. Oh, please do like, share, and subscribe if you like the videos. It's always welcome to have more people watching them. And again, thank you.